Welcome again to another episode of Tech Command Investing, your go to podcast for insights into the cutting edge world of space, defense, and cybersecurity technologies. Hosted by myself, Anna Gavin, a seasoned expert in deep tech investments and disruptive technology. Today, my guest is Sam Adlen, who leads Space Solar, one of the very few startups in this field globally. In this episode, we'll delve into the world of space based solar power stations and strategic importance to both civilian and military contexts. So let's just dive in there, Sam, and try to give me a bit about your vision. Sam, imagine I'm in a blackout at 2 a.m. And also had this in Portugal and Spain yesterday, or this case in Nairobi or Kiev. How close are you to flipping a switch and beaming power from space to the ground in seconds? And when did you first realize that beaming energy from orbit wasn't just science fiction, but a viable answer to climate change, security, and sovereignty?
Thanks, Alan. Great to be joining you today. So, I think that the flexibility of space-based solar power is one of its real strengths. And so, there's two answers to your question. Um, Firstly, you can see the satellite behind my head there. So, in a high Earth orbit, you can see a third of the Earth's surface and instantaneously switch the beam between points in the field of view. Now, so if there was a rectenna where where there's a blackout, then you can instantaneously switch the beam and power would be there. If there's no rectenna or there've been other issues that means power is affected, you'd need to roll in a rectenna, say on a truck, and deploy that. So that will then take however long it takes to get a truck there with a rectenna. So a matter of hours. And I think it's that flexibility that really lends itself as such an important part of the future energy mix, both for security and for and for broader commercial grid applications. And I mean, for me, my journey's been in the space sector for my whole career, and I've always believed in what space can do for Earth. That's sort of been central to everything I've done. And I spent, as I think you know, a decade as chief strategy officer at the Satellite Applications Catapult, which is the UK's main innovation centre for space, and very much focused on what space can do for Earth and the economic benefits it can drive. And I think probably 5 6 years ago, recognizing the step change we're about to see in launch costs and launch capacity through Starship, and having watched the last innovation cycle in the space sector, where small satellites just kept doing things that traditional industry said no, 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 and it kept happening yes, 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 and just recognizing that there's a range of concepts that have been around for a long time, like space solar power. It's not a new concept, but suddenly the technical feasibility is matched by the economic feasibility. And so that's really driven me for the last 5 years to be working on space-based solar power.
So the stakes are pretty high. You've said net zero is illusion without better technologies. What's the uncomfortable truth we're not facing about wind and solar? And if space based solar power fails, who loses most? Is it emerging markets, militaries, or the average citizen in blackout prone regions?
Yeah, we've got huge energy issues. I saw some stuff this week. It's really coming into focus now with AI as well. So, prior to the huge step change we're seeing recently, we were looking at energy demand doubling by 2050. Eric Schmidt was talking to the policy people in the US, I think this week, and saying that AI could take 99% of US electricity demand. Now, that's the sort of challenge we're looking at. And wherever the number is doesn't matter. It's going to be big, and we need lots of energy. We need clean energy, and it needs to be the right sort of energy. So the challenges with the intermittent renewables are the fact that they're low energy density
Mm.
and they're intermittent. So I mean, the first thing I'd say is we need everything, and it's fantastic the advances that are taking place everywhere because we're going to need it all. But one of the things that space solar power does is really help the whole energy system to work. So the challenges with intermittents are that because they're when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, you've got to you've got to have battery storage of the duration and scale and economics that are needed. So that's one challenge. And then because they're low energy density, the mining and minerals challenge that they then kick on is really significant. So we've got a big structural challenge in minerals and mining to actually address to be able to meet the world's energy needs based on intermittent renewables plus batteries alone. Now, if you look, for example, at I think there's a recent UAE nominally 1 gigawatt baseload plant that's just been signed off. So the headline price is 6 billion, and that 6 billion for 1 gigawatt. You need 5 gigawatts of solar panels because you need to overbuild, and then you need 19 gigawatt hours of battery storage. So you start to add all that up, 6 billion for a gigawatt is better than nuclear, but it's not brilliant. What we're looking at with space solar power, with launch costs about half of what they are today, you're down well below that. Our capex is around 2.25 billion per gigawatt, and with if Elon Musk goes anything close to what he talks about in terms of launch cost price, the economics just get incredible, way better than terrestrial solar. So this is a really important part of the future energy mix. The reason it then helps the whole system to work is back to this flexibility, Anna. So if, again, the other thing the intermittents pose is a huge requirement on the grid for upgrade. It needs to be a very flexible grid. You've got to be able to push energy in all sorts of ways at all sorts of different times. And that's a huge cost to the system. So Imperial College did a study, just looked at the UK, and 2 gigawatts of space-based solar power input into the UK energy system alone saves over £1 billion a year in energy system costs because of the need to not overbuild, because of the reduced need to upgrade the grid, and because you can instantaneously export the power if you don't need it. So if you look at that then internationally, you can really optimize the whole energy system and really help everyone ultimately to have cheaper, cleaner, more scalable power.
I mean, really following on from that about the strategic energy shift that's happening. Um, yeah, and you already mentioned it about the explosion of data centers and the rise of generative AI. And 99%, I haven't heard that figure, but I heard that but Eric last week was mentioning some quite radical figures for also how fast generative AI is going to take off in terms of intelligence. That all leads to accelerated global demand for energy. Wind and terrestrial solar simply can't scale fast enough to keep up, I think. That's why we're seeing a surge of a sort of modern day energy gold rush into advanced technologies like small modular reactors and space-based solar power. And if you look at figure one, which you can also see if you're listening on audio in the downlink in the app, the advanced energy tech roadmap, SMRs appear to be pulling ahead. But is this really a race to a single winner, or are we entering an era where multiple energy architectures, SMRs, space-based solar power, and others coexist, each owning a different slice of the energy terrain? I'd like to open up a strategic discussion around technological complementaries, not just competition.
Yeah, it absolutely needs to be that. It needs to be that for various reasons. The main thing being resilience. So if you want a resilient energy system, you need diversity. So let's say you want at least 5 different energy sources in your mix, so that if one thing changes, you've got resilience and redundancy. I think the other thing is that with all these new sources, whilst there's good modeling and reasonable predictions, ultimately you don't know the economics that are going to come out. You don't know exactly when they're going to come to market. And really importantly, you don't know what the N of a kind economics are going to look like. So our CTO came from the world of fusion. He was engineer in charge at the world's biggest fusion project. And he thinks fusion is brilliant. He thinks it'll work. What he doesn't think is that he thinks the timescales are still challenging. He thinks you'll get more energy out, get energy in very soon, but commercializing it is really challenging. And what does the N of a kind system look like? Does it look like nuclear fission, where actually the N plus one is actually more expensive than the previous? Or does it look like terrestrial solar, where actually because you've got mass production economics, the costs reduce and reduce and reduce. And that's where we are with space-based solar power, because the systems are hypermodular. So they comprise of hundreds of thousands of the same modules, which means you've got mass production economics. We can put up tens of gigawatts a year and really make a material impact on net zero timescales. I mean, on timescales that we're going to need to keep the lights on, frankly, with the way things are going.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but deploying massive infrastructure in space to harvest solar energy sounds less like building a product and more like constructing sovereign infrastructure. Looking at figure two, the space power generation landscape, we see clear activity from Japan, the US, China, and the UK. These aren't just research projects, they're building the first orbital power stations. So tell us, which sovereign entity is really winning the space-based solar power race right now? And when do you think this goes from science fiction to science fact?
I think it's already moved away from science fiction. I think it's really important to sort of recognize that it's just an engineering project now. This is the physics is all completely understood, and there's a huge amount of activity going on globally, as you say. So China are talking about kilometer scale arrays by 2028. Japan's got they're the world leaders in wireless power transmission. They've got a demo mission going next year. Um, the US then have been doing a lot through the defense community, so funding both large structures in space and wireless power,
Mhm.
and also funding now a company called Etherflux through their advanced energy program, because they recognise the value of space-based solar power. But the UK has actually had a leadership position, particularly from a kind of policy and ecosystem perspective. And through space solar, we've got, the class leading design for microwave system here. So there's a lot of activity going on. I think I think the US have taken a bit of a lead recently, particularly with the recent Etherflux raise of $50 million. But it's both, yeah, it's competition, it's collaboration and competition to get there. Hopefully to do good for the world and give us the clean energy we need. And then for those with a more of a defense focused view of the world, there's also the competitive advantage that can be delivered on the battlefield. So I think it's all to play for. It certainly won't be a winner takes all market. And I think the other thing to emphasize is just the benefits on the journey. So going on this space solar power journey, there's the wireless power, which has tons of applications, and then we're really seeing so much interest in how you can build large structures in space, from data centers to space solar power to next gen satcoms to whatever, providing the power requirements for new materials in microgravity. So the space sector is going to get really, really interesting over the next 5, 10 years.
And then my follow-on question maybe to that is, how do those startups, do they remain within their sovereign ecosystem, or do you think there are startups that will be selling this to the UK or to Europe, or would Japan be selling it to the rest of Asia or to the US? Do you think there's that crossover possible between the startups, or will they pretty much be sovereign in their build up and remain sovereign to have that technical and sovereign advantage over the others?
I think it depends. It'll depend on the geopolitics, both at just at a national level generally, and also at a defense collaboration level. So we shall see. I think there's lots of opportunities for great partnerships. Certainly from a space solar from a space solar perspective, we're setting up from the start to be a globally successful company. But yeah, there are some of the technologies that we're developing are on lists for things that will need to be signed off before export, or collaboration. It'll be the same coming the other way for other countries. But what we're developing has a huge range of potential, both for defense and commercial application, and it can do an incredible amount of good for the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, that leads nicely onto yeah, what your technical solution is for this and the elegance of it, which I thought was quite astounding. So I'd love you to take us inside your Cassiopeia solution. What was the aha moment in its design that changed the game? And for a non-engineer among us, what does it actually take to beam a gigawatt of energy from way up there in space? Can you break it down like you're talking to a 10-year-old? And also, I mean, what stops us from being frazzled when the beam may hit us?
All very good questions. So let me refer to you for those that are watching to figure three. I'll talk you initially through how space-based solar power works, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Cassiopeia design, which is indeed very elegant. So the 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 solution in principle is really, really simple. I mean, all we're doing is putting large arrays of solar panels up in space, and you're doing that for two reasons. One, you get that 24/7 power, so you get the baseload energy that's so important for the functioning of the grid. And then for a country like the UK, you get 13 times more incident energy. So that's what really drives the economics through the system. Up in space, we then convert that energy into high frequency radio waves. So it's the same technology as we're all comfortable with, say, with satellite communications or any sort of radio technology where you've got uh, RF electronics driving antennas that are pushing out a radio wave. In our case, we're beaming at 5.8 gigahertz, which is Wi-Fi frequency. So it's exactly the same frequency that we're walking around in, all of us, probably pretty regularly every day.
Yeah.
So then that gets transmitted down to Earth in a low power density coherent beam. So a low power density beam. So it's designed with safety first. We're using, let's say, high frequency radio waves. And the maximum intensity is a quarter of the intensity of the midday sun. And then you get a little bell curve across the receiving antenna on the ground. So at the middle of the rectenna, it's that quarter of the midday sun. And at the edges, it's below the long-term microwave background exposure limits, which the regulators say we can all walk around in forever and be absolutely fine. The technology at the rectenna it's very simple. So rather than, again, we're all very comfortable with the fact that you can capture a communication signal and take the signal and then turn that back into data or whatever. In this case, it's just simple diodes. You take your your AC wave, and it's called rectification, and that's technology that's existed for many decades, and actually proven at the right efficiencies back in the 1970s. So the receiving antennas interesting. They're large structures, about a kilometer plus in scale, but they're like a mesh on poles. They're transparent. You can grow crops underneath it. You could overlay it over a solar farm. You could overlay it over a data center. Co-locate it with a wind farm. Lots of flexibility. The systems up in space are also large, and that's part of the reason it's not been a thing to date. It's a concept that was first mooted by Isaac Asimov back in the 1940s, and have been technical designs ever since the 60s. And it's always been considered technically viable. It's the economics that we touched on earlier that's changed. So these, ultimately looking at kilometer scale structures, and so it's the launch costs that have changed, and that's where the Cassiopeia design comes in. So you can see it behind my head there for those that are watching, and so what you've got there at the heart of it. So one of the other challenges with space solar power is you go around the orbit, you've got a changing angle between the sun and the Earth. So you need to somehow, historically, many designs have had a big mechanical rotating joint, which is A, heavy, and B, it's a single point failure. You don't want those sort of things in space. What we've got is a completely solid state design. So it's like a 3D phased array radar. So you can see the CDs, what look like CDs behind my head, they're big reflectors. They always point at the sun, so it's a sun pointing design. And then they shine the light onto the helix, if you consider it like a spiral staircase. You've got you've got the PV on the top and bottom of the steps, and then you've got your little dipole antennas between the steps radiating out tangentially. And that's what allows us to do that. It means the parts get used all the time, which lowers the mass, which gives you the great economics. And because you point at the sun all the time, you can use different orbits, which means we can have much smaller satellites in different orbits on the development program. So rather than as you know, Alan, going to your first investor saying, "Can I have 10 billion for my MVP?" It tends to get a bit of sucking of teeth. We've got a much more investable roadmap, and that's something that I think's changed a lot for space solar power recently.
Yeah, I mean, exactly following onto that, because that's exactly what I was getting onto now, which is the investor lens. And Sam, you've talked about in your deck a 50 times return within 6 years. That sounds like hype until you look at the numbers. If we bring in figure four, space solar financing mix by phase and year, we can see how early grants evolve into equity and debt as we scale from minimum viable product, as you said, to commercial deployment in the early 2030s. So, so how do early investors actually realize those returns? What's your view on the UK National Wealth Fund's approach, plugging gaps without crowding out the private sector? In other words, how do you ensure that it doesn't become a public sector project rather than a mixed public and private initiative?
Space solar is a really high high impact, high return, high optionality business for investors. So if we look at year 4, there's a range of options for investors at that point, because we will have proved end-to-end, meaningful power from a large structure in space. So we'll have de-risked everything, and we'll have a working product. So if you look at the comparables then with, say, nuclear fusion, where you've had companies IPOing at valuations of 5 billion plus without even a working product, you can start to see that with the baseload technology that we're developing, that's the sort of thing you can aim for. So at that point, what the approach we're taking in order to limit the capital requirements on early investors is that of renewables developers. So we're creating SPVs, special purpose vehicles, for each power station, so we can recycle the capital. So we can either be raising finance for the first commercial MVP, or we've got options to exit for trade sales, both on wireless power or large space structures. Um, and it, just those two elements there, you're looking at, 10x multiples at least on the because of the value of the technologies that we're creating, that we're creating there. And at all points, as you move along the journey, you're moving closer and closer to the DCF on the ultimate electricity production as the key sort of metric for how you're looking at the valuation of the business. And so for early investors, there's very clear steps along the journey as you discount the discount gets less and less, that your valuation gets higher and higher. So yeah, we've modeled this, and we'd love to talk it through with any investors that would want to come on the journey with us. I think the National Wealth Fund's a great introduction. It's the way that public and private capital work for supporting infrastructure businesses, I think, is really key, and it's not quite there yet. For many infrastructure businesses, the system just doesn't quite work because you're looking at largish seed rounds to get to meaningful milestones. And so I think the National Wealth Fund's great, but they're typically 25 million and looking at Series A or even Series B plus. So it's tricky for us. They've been really helpful, and with political will, I think they would be quite interested to support. But we need to find ways in that case for public and private finance to come together. But it's a really tricky chicken and egg situation, because on the one hand, government needs to use its money really well, and hence it likes the signal from private capital. On the other hand, once the private capital is there, the government funding is needed much less. So I don't think the balance has quite been struck yet. The thing that I would love to see more of is less of a hands-off relationship between industry and government, because if they could be a little bit more open and maybe make contingent offers, things would happen much more readily, much more freely, and we'd get a lot more growth out.
Exactly, going on to that, where you're talking about some applications there. You're also talking about beaming to drones in the air, which I hadn't thought of yet, but that obviously is another solution. Let's bring in figure five, early space-based solar power market applications. It shows us the early wins for space-based solar power won't be rooftop panels or grid backup. Will be things like military logistics, polar research, water desalination, and even lunar power when the US and others get to the moon. So where does space-based solar power land first? What will we actually see running by the end of this decade?
By the end of the decade, we hope to have our intent is to have a gigawatt scale plants up in space, and by the mid 2040s, we're looking at 15 gigawatts total. So there's a range of both grid and off-grid markets. I mean, that's one of the beauties of space solar power. Its flexibility. It'll depend a bit on where the ultimate customers come from, but we've got letters of interest from energy companies, we've got interest from governments, and we've got interest from a range of different entities such as polar power and defence. So it'll depend a bit on what comes in when. Uh, but
Mm,
if I were to bet, I think it'll be defence and polar comes first, um, because of the need, because of the relatively high energy prices, and because we can deliver power from a low Earth orbit, which leads to a much smaller satellite, which leads to a smaller MVP, and much lower capital costs to that MVP. Uh, that said, we do have people who understand the energy system and people who've got real energy needs really value the baseload power that we can deliver. So,
mm.
I think there's a reasonably good chance that we'll also get um, you know, customers, stakeholders, consortia coming together around our 30 megawatt system. In that case, again, that could be for nations, it could be for a data center, those sorts of organizations. But yeah, the energy needs are not going away. Yeah, without huge upgrades to the grid, there's going to be a real need for flexible baseload power like we can provide with space solar power.
And onto that subject about dual use in defense and looking at bringing in here figure 6, the dual use technology timeline, we see a clear pattern. GPS, the internet, drones all began as military innovations before becoming global infrastructure. And I saw that again when I was at the UK Ukraine Defense Tech Forum on Friday. Could space based solar power be next? And how do you balance the strategic power projection potential with the need for commercial trust? And what does it mean to beam power into remote or contested regions? No cables, no fuel convoys, just clean energy from orbit. That changes the game, doesn't it?
Yeah, got lots of potential for defense. So I think from a defense tech investment perspective, it's a very interesting place. So you've both got the end game around space solar power, but as I mentioned, powering drones, um, powering forward operating bases, and then actually large uses of RF in space, both for powering assets and for other, well, let's say RF denial, those sorts of things. And then large structures. Building large structures is actually of interest to the defense community around the world. So there's a huge range of optionality for this investment from a defense perspective. And then ultimately, yes, power power is central to everything. And I think being able to deliver that power remotely on demand is going to be of huge strategic importance. And we've got the huge lessons from the Sangan Valley issue that that we had, and I think the defence community is very well aware of that. I mean, obviously, the need there is for high reliability, um, high power density power, um, but having the flexibility, b the fact you don't need to have these fuel convoys, and and then see the fact that it is green and clean. This is really coming to the fore now. So I think you've seen the investment recently in Etherflux, US company, as they've recently raised $50 million. They're doing laser-based, space-based solar power. So you can beam the energy down by laser. It's got some advantages insofar as you've got a higher power density, you have a smaller beam on the spot size on the ground. So you could potentially have just an individual soldier, sorry, with with solar panels that they could power. The disadvantages then come when you scale. So obviously, a gigawatt scale laser starts to become pretty challenging from a safety perspective. You've got much bigger conversion losses, and you've got atmospheric absorption. So, in terms of delivering baseload and in terms of delivering at scale, the technology is less applicable. But it's absolutely fantastic to see, and that's all supported by DoD investment in the US, and DARPA's looking at both wireless power beaming and at large structures. So I think the defense interest in everything that's going on here is growing is growing really, really rapidly.
Mm, mm. And then moving on from there to sovereignty and space as a theater, if a nation can beam power to its own satellite hub or forward deployed base, it shifts how we think about sovereign energy dependence and deterrence. Are governments starting to recognize space based solar power as critical sovereign infrastructure? And then follow on from that is how do they reconcile that with international energy cooperation when space, while still mostly cooperative, is starting to be strategically contested zone? How do they adapt to those changing situations in space?
Yeah, it's a it's a rapidly changing environment, both in space and then with energy markets terrestrially. Uh, Yeah, so this is very much viewed as critical national infrastructure. So we've had good conversations with Space Command and others, and this would be very much viewed in that way, um, and would need to be managed in that way as well. So, in that context, we've taken a holistic approach to development, looked at sort of security and cyber right from the start, and there were some real strengths to this in terms of its resilience that it offers, and there's also some downsides, but it can all be managed. And space is absolutely becoming a contested zone. It's long been considered the ultimate high ground, and I think it's really starting to play out like that. It's certainly a bipolar environment now, if not multipolar. And pragmatically, we just need to protect our assets and hopefully grow both the commercial and sovereign and hopefully global interests. Because I think one thing that space, I'm confident it will do it over time. I think it will have teething problems, but space will bring nations together. And actually, I think something like space solar power will bring nations together as well. Because whilst you can do a one satellite to one antenna solution and just provide baseload to sort of one point in one country, the system really sings when you've got multiple satellites and multiple antennas and you're sharing energy. And trading between nations brings nations together. Energy sharing between nations will do the same. Lots of innovation to be delivered there. Be very interesting to see how it plays out. And energy sharing will definitely be geopolitical. But I think space solar power can be a really important part of a bright and hopefully harmonious future for the planet.
So yeah, all this, Sam, looks all very exciting and incredibly promising for the future. But what's the catch? Is it launch costs? I mean, you mentioned that at the beginning, that it's because of the reduction in cost and the Starship from SpaceX that will change the economics. Or is it regulation? Or is it ground infrastructure or political inertia? What needs to happen in the next 18 to 36 months to turn this vision into energy coming down from orbit?
Yes, there's some. It's basically a big engineering program. It's about engineering the economics. We've just finished a £2 million study with the UK government, and the results look really strong. With the economics already as good as offshore wind, and with pathways to be better than terrestrial solar. And because of the approach we've taken, we've been very lucky to work with the regulators, which is one of the potential long poles in the tent. But they've said that with political will, that the roadmap is deliverable. Um, I think political support is important. That it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, because
Yeah.
commercial finance actually helps bring political support, which brings commercial finance. It's a chicken egg scenario, which I'll come back to because you mentioned the National Wealth Fund. Um, so actually, the two things at the moment that are potential blockers is financing, because this is an infrastructure business. Much as well, much as we're taking this renewable developers approach, the sort of capital requirements as an early stage business aren't what the typical financial systems set up to fund. But with this is financeable completely privately. That 50x number, that's the number for complete private finance, and it's double that if you had 50% grants, for example. And then probably the other thing that would become a limiting factor at some point is the rectenna sizes. Again, you can go to slightly higher frequencies and reduce your rectenna size, but you increase, you then have to increase power densities to get the same power out. So those are the sorts of trade-offs, but it's very deliverable, and importantly, deliverable in time and then scalable to be able to make a really big difference to net zero. On the financing side of it, I mean, you mentioned the National Wealth Fund. I think it's a great initiative, um, but there is this gap still. So for us, we're raising a seed round at the moment. They'll typically come in Series A, and typically for check sizes above 25 million.
Yeah, I mean, the National Wealth Fund is 25 million plus ticket. It's later stage, yeah.
Exactly. We could put 25 million to use very, very effectively. We've got plans that extend well beyond that, but because of our stage, without a sort of political nudge, we're probably not quite in the crosshairs. So there's still a bit of a gap there, and it's a really, really tricky balance. The way to how to not crowd out finance, but yeah, to be able to be bold enough to take risks of government before you've got that leading indicator from private finance. It's a really, really tricky aim. I think the innovations and the thought that are going into it, such as the National Wealth Fund, are excellent, but there's still work to do.
And then finally, just looking ahead, for those listening who want to understand the future in this field, or the future of this field, is there one book you'd recommend, something that captures the ambition, scale, or innovation of solar power in space?
The sort of book I'd point to for a beginner's guide to space solar power would be the book by John Mankins is kind of considered the godfather of space-based solar power. So he's got a book called the Case for Space Solar Power. So that's worth a read. There's a nice book on power beaming by Paul Jaffe, who leads the DARPA wireless power program. That's very good. And actually, for me, there's a book I like called The Next 100 Years. It's written in 2008 by George Friedman, who's a sort of strategist, but did a very nice job of picking pretty much the UK-Ukraine war, pretty much picked the pandemic. And he very much moves towards space as the thing that then really is the dominant driver in terms of which nations sort of lead the world, and space-based solar power becomes a really important part of the both energy mix and in terms of delivering advantage on the battlefield. In his case, not till 2070, so a little bit out there,
Oh,
hopefully.
okay.
But
The way to
but
go then, yeah.
yeah, but I think actually it's got some really nice ideas in it, and it just shows the importance of space.
Right, fantastic. So we're done. Thanks for your time, Sam, and to the next episode.
Thanks, Elaine.
If you're an LP interested in learning about space tech, defense tech, and security, including cybersecurity investment opportunities, let's chat.